Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out his vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his parables with sword. His truth is marching on.
Rolling your own. And I don't mean cigarettes. I love hand loading and reloading ammunition. I love making precision ammunition on custom load recipes. It's time consuming and it's a painstaking process, but it's very rewarding. Not even counting the load development phase, which would be a whole nother video, the process of brass sorting, prep and sizing, measuring charges to the hundredth of a grain, limiting the interference between the neck and the bullet, and seating the bullet to the correct thousandths of an inch. It can take all day just to load one box of rifle rounds. It's worth it to me. It's art and it's science together, and it's just amazing. But I'm not getting into that today. I will make videos on that in the future, I promise, but not today. I love precision shooting, but the bulk of the shooting I do is not really precision shooting. Running speed drills and pistol bays and rifle bays doesn't require precision ammunition. After all, the ranges are usually 25 meters or less, and it's usually less than that. It's not hunting, it's not self-defense, it's not something that's critical. So what I really need is just range fodder. Cheap ammo and lots of it. The biggest reason I started reloading was to produce cheaper ammunition for my trips to the range, specifically semi-auto handgun calibers and 5.56. On that note, yes, the cost per round is substantially cheaper. The reality, however, is I spend much more on ammo now than I did before because I'm shooting so much more than I used to. The volume is so much more. Instead of a 50-round box of 9mm on a trip to the range, I might shoot 200 rounds of reloads. I'm spending more, but I'm getting more bang for my buck, pun intended. Funny thing is, when I go to the range now, I spend about a third of my time picking up brass. And not just mine either. I get giddy when I get to the range and find that somebody left a nice pile of 9mm or 45 or 5.56 to pick up. I try to always come home with more brass than I took with me. And I'm a little obsessed, really. I'll shoot a full mag, and before the last piece even hits the ground, I'm thinking, now where did all that brass go? I gotta go find it. I will make a little confession. I have crawled around on my hands and knees for more than just a little while, looking for that one last piece of brass. Is there a 12-step program for brass addiction? If so, I might ought to find one. There's a few different types of reloaders out there. There's those that only pick up their own brass, and some people can be quite obsessive in keeping logbooks on their brass and tracking it down, and they can tell you just how many times brass has been loaded, what load has been in it. There's others, they only pick up shiny, clean brass that would be easy to deal with. And then there's guys like me, and if it's brass, I pick it up. Brass, nickel, I don't care. I love it. And I take all calibers too. It doesn't matter if I have a gun in that caliber or not. I get enough of it, I can trade it for something I need. So what I end up with when I come home is this. Lots of nasty range brass. It's full of sand. It's dirty. It's pretty disgusting. But this can be turned into this with a little time and attention. Let me walk you through it. The first thing I do is I begin to sort the brass by caliber. And I'll take a handful of the brass, and what I have is I'll have a can typically over here in size order. I'll have 9mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP, and then miscellaneous, in which I'm going to throw any rifle brass I typically might have picked up on those ranges, or oddball calibers, things that I'm not going to have very much of. Things like 357 SIG, 45 GEP, 38 Super. Stuff like that is going to go in this can, and then all of that will get sorted at a later date when I accumulate enough of it. And it's painstaking, but it makes it a whole lot simpler when you go to clean it if you have it sorted by size. 9mm have a funny habit of sticking inside of 40 Smith & Wesson cases, and once they get in there with some of that grit from the tumbler, it is really hard to get them apart. The second step after the brass is all sorted by caliber is a hot bath. I typically use my kitchen sink, but you could use a bucket, a wash tub, your bathtub. It doesn't matter. The key is hot water and dish soap. And scrub it and get it all agitated and get all of that sand and dirt knocked loose and knocked off. Then wash the soapy water off, fill it up with fresh water, purge it, and then rinse it until you've gotten all that sand and grit washed away that you can. After you've got it washed and you've got the water shaken off, load it onto cookie sheets and pop them suckers in the oven. I turn the oven down as low as it will go, the lowest setting I can get, and it's still run. Set the sheets in there, and I block the door open with a wooden spatula so that steam can't escape. I let mine bake for 20 minutes. This seems to be sufficient to get all the water evaporated out of the brass and leave it ready for the next step. Once it's dry, pull those sheets out and let the brass cool. Be careful, hot brass will burn you, and burn you pretty good. But let it cool, and what you're going to be left with is this. And this looks pretty good. This is not ready to reload, but it's a whole lot cleaner than it was, and it's ready for the next step. The fourth step after the brass is cool is to load it into a tumbler. This is a dry tumbler. I use walnut shell media. This is not the only kind of tumbler. This is a vibratory tumbler, which is a dry tumbler, but there's another kind that's known as a wet tumbler, which uses stainless steel pins to clean the brass. And I got to tell you what, it's more expensive, but it is far superior as far as appearance. It makes the brass look like new. It is shiny and bright, and it cleans the inside to look like new brass. It cleans out the flash hole, the primer pockets, everything. However, looks aren't everything. The brass will be perfectly functional, tumbled in dry media. And what I do is with something like 9mm, which is what I'm working with today, I'm going to typically try to load about 200 cases in here at one time. They're small, they don't take up much room, and this can easily accommodate 200 cases to vibrate at one time. Once the brass is loaded in, you place the cover on, bolt it down, and turn it on. I typically let my brass tumble for 2 hours minimum, sometimes longer, but 2 hours is typically sufficient, and we're just trying to get the inside clean, get the primer pockets mostly clean, get it ready to reload. After the brass is tumbled sufficiently, take it out of the tumbler, shake the media out of it back into the tumbler, and then I load it into these reloading trays or reloading blocks, whichever you want to call them. Each of these accommodates 50 pieces of brass, so I have 100 total here, ready for the next step. The fifth step takes a little time, running each case through the sizing die. This is where a Dillon square deal or a Hornady progressive would really come in handy. I use a single stage press, so what I do is I batch load my ammo. In other words, I'll take probably 100 cases. It's usually 100 cases. Sometimes I only make 50. But I'll take those cases and I'll put all 100 pieces through a process before I move on to the next. In this case, I'm going to run all 100 pieces through the sizing die before I go on to the next step. All the brass is going to arrive at the end of this together. The sizing die removes the spent primer and reshapes the brass to factory specifications, if set correctly. You have to read the instructions, and you have to take your time and get your dies set correctly. Otherwise, you're going to have serious problems. After this step, the process can vary some. If I was working with, say, 5.56 NATO or 7.62 NATO, the process would be quite a bit different. If you're using military head stamp brass, in fact some commercial brands as well, there is a crimp on the primer pocket that has to be removed before the brass can be reprimed. And you would typically do this after you resize it and deprime it and before you move on to another step. There are a couple of options you can do that, but that's a subject for another video. With this 9mm brass, that is not a factor. That's not something I have to deal with this today. This is also when case length becomes a factor. The brass actually stretches. When it's fired, the brass takes the shape of the chamber of whatever weapon you are firing, Exactly. It's called fire forming. The brass is pressed into the chamber and takes the shape of it exactly. Well, that's bigger than the factory size brass. You can't have the brass the same size as the chamber, or you're never going to get the rounds chambered effectively. With rifles, you can. That's a different story. But with semi-auto caliber handguns, the brass has to be resized to factory specification. So when you resize the brass and the depriming is done, and the size is reshaped, well, that brass has been what we say it's been worked. And when you work the brass, it is stretching it somewhat. A minute amount, the brass is being stretched. Well, that metal has to go somewhere. It's not going back to where it was originally. The only place it can go is to the open end of the brass, or the mouth of these cases. It would be the neck on rifle brass. So what that does is it makes the case longer every time you work the brass. Well, the problem is that you can only make that case so much longer, and then the round becomes out of spec. It's not going to run in your gun. If the brass gets to a certain length, and there's going to be a max length listed for each cartridge, then the brass would have to be trimmed or discarded. When we go to our load data book and turn to the section on 9mm Luger or 9mm Parabellum, we look and we see that the max case length listed for the 9mm is 0.754 or 754 thousandths of an inch. If the case exceeds this length, then it has to be trimmed or discarded before it can be used. As long as it is less than this, it is acceptable. There is also what's called a case trim length. If the case length were to exceed that maximum of 754 thousandths, then you would trim it back to 749 thousandths, only taking 5 thousandths of an inch off. It only takes just a little bit to make a big difference when you're talking about loading ammunition. Length in handgun brass is not critical as long as it is less than the max length, as opposed to precision rifle brass, when even brand new brass, custom ordered from, say, as I like Lapua, even then brand new brass is going to be sized and trimmed to a specific length. Why? Because you're going for uniformity with precision ammo, not so much with range ammo. Brass can be shortened using a case trimmer, but unless it has been repeatedly loaded, in the case with handgun ammo, handgun brass seldom exceeds max length. Typically, what has been my experience is that you'll have something like a case split or deform grossly, maybe an extraction deformation, before you reach that length. I have not had to trim any handgun brass yet. Typically, I get such a good influx of new range brass coming in that it's not so much of an issue. I did, however, spot check this brass when I put it into the blocks to ensure that it was all right. I didn't check every single case. That would take a long time. And when we're talking about range ammo, we're talking about quantity. We're talking about getting them done quickly, making it time effective. Otherwise, I might as well just go to the Wally Mart and buy some cheap stuff they got for a little bit more. As for this batch of 9mm brass, as soon as I get done removing the primers and resizing all of them, they will be ready for the next step. Because of the shape of handgun bullets, the case mouth has to be expanded slightly. As little as possible, really. Because otherwise you won't be able to seat the new bullet into the case after it's charged. So you have to very carefully go through and expand every one of the mouths. It puts a very slight flare on the end of the case. You want to do it as little as possible, because if you were to flare it too much, it would split the case. But if you flare it too little, when you go to seat the bullet, you'll crush it, as is the case with this 44 Magnum I made early on in my reloading career. Now that all the cases in this batch have been expanded, the next step is to reprime them. For that operation, the quickest way, at least for me, is to use one of these. This is a repriming tool from Hornady. It has a tray that you can load. You could load a couple of hundred, at least, small pistol primers onto it. I've got 100 on it right now. I've already got it set up with the appropriate shell holder for 9mm, and we're ready to get going on this. This is a fairly quick process, but like everything with reloading, you still need to be careful. If you get in a big hurry, you get things like upside down primers, sideways primers, crushed primers, primers seated too deeply. All kinds of things can happen, so you still have to take your time and make sure that you do the job correctly. Let me demonstrate this for you here. To prime the cases, I simply hold the priming tool in my left hand since I'm right-handed, and you keep it with a little bit of a downward tilt so that gravity will pull the next primer into place so that it can be primed into the case. Set the case in top, fully seat it, give the handle a squeeze, let off so the spring can pull it back down, and here's what you get. A fresh new primer in the case. Then we simply repeat this process for all 100 cases in this batch. And this really is, let me just kind of demonstrate that this is a fairly fast process. Trying to be careful still. If it feels strange, stop. If it doesn't feel like it's seating correctly, stop, because you're about to mess something up. It's that quick. Too easy. Something I forgot to mention earlier is that you have to be certain to use the correct primers for your application when you reprime your brass. For this application, since I'm shooting 9mm Luger, I used CCI small pistol primers, number 500 series. That is the correct primer for this application. Primers can be similar in size, but be completely different. Rifle primers and pistol primers may look alike, but they're not the same thing. It could be disastrous to use the wrong primer. Now that we've got all of the brass in this batch reprimed, the next step is to put gas in the tank, so to speak. It's time to throw powder charges. To know how much powder to use, you must use load data. Get a good load book. There are many of them out there that you can choose from. This is the Hornady book that I'm using. And typically for Hornady projectiles, that's what I use as the Hornady book. Today, I'm actually going to be using load data from Hodgins because I'm going to be going from the load data off of the tight group powder. The reason being is that Hornady does not list load data for tight group. Therefore, the Hodgin data is perfectly reliable. They list a maximum charge. You reduce that by 10% to start until you find a load that works for you. I am still going to be using the cartridge overall links listed from Hornady because I'm using a Hornady Action Pistol bullet or HAP bullets. I like these for range training. They load like hollow points, but they perform like full metal jackets. They don't expand, but they are excellent training ammunition. For this operation, I'm using a charge thrower type powder measure. This Hodgins type powder resembles small little flat discs, and it tends to meter very well too. Not as good as a spherical, but still very, very well. By the way, in case you didn't know, a pound of powder has 7,000 grains in it. Since I need 4.3 grains per charge day for my 9mm, that's equal to 1,627 charges out of this bottle of powder. It comes to just under 2 cents a charge. With a little patience, I would manage to get this adjusted to the 4.3 grains that I want. I've thrown a few charges to verify. Next, I'm going to start loading these trays, and about every 20 charges, I'll stop and take a measurement to ensure that I'm still throwing even charges. Now that I have the powder charge set exactly where I want it, I can begin throwing my charges into my cases that have been prepped. As I go, I will stop about every 20 cases, throw a charge into my measuring pan, put it on the scale to ensure that it's still throwing the amount of powder I want in each charge. I used to stop and measure about every 5, but the reality is that you spend a lot of time measuring, and what I found is that I can really trust this measure. It does a very consistent job, especially considering this is range ammunition, and as I said before, we'll be using it in short range. With the charges thrown, the next step is to seat the bullets into the cases. The bullet seating die has to be adjusted for a specific bullet to a specific depth. If I were to decide that I wanted to use a different type of bullet on these, I would have to readjust my die accordingly. You can't just use it with any old bullets that you find. It has to be set up correctly. I'm using 115 grain Hornady action pistol bullets and have my die set for them, which is to say that when I place the bullet, it's going to put a very light crimp on the case once the bullet is to the correct position, and it will be at the correct max overall cartridge length for this round. It is imperative to check the cartridge overall length, or COAL, as you seat your bullets periodically to make sure that you are seating to the correct depth. The maximum overall length for this 150 grain Hornady is 1 inch and 75 thousandths. Measuring this one here, I'm coming out at just under that, so I'm okay. You cannot let your cartridge exceed that length, especially when you're talking about a semi-automatic pistol. Measure another one here. That one is 1 and 75 thousandths. It's on the nose. Perfect. Now that all the bullets are sat and crimped, what I'm left with is 100 freshly minted beautiful brass range quality rounds. Each round costing approximately 17.7 cents a piece. Or if you were to multiply that by 50, it would be $8.85 for a box of 50. That being said, that's $2-3 cheaper than the cheap brass ammo at Walmart. So it may not be worth it to you. It may not be worth your time and the trouble for you to personally reload ammunition. For me, I enjoy the process. I enjoy paying less per round, and I can do it at night or when the weather is lousy or when I can't otherwise go to the range and shoot anyway. Plus, it's recycling. It's reusing all that brass that's laying on the ground, and I'm all for recycling. I got another video on recycling coming soon. It'll be fun, I promise you. I'll tell you one more thing. There's a great feeling of pride that comes when you step on the range, you lock that first magazine, and you sling your home-rolled rounds down range for the first time. And spending a whole lot less than the guy next to you shooting steel-cased ammunition. If you have questions about this video, or about reloading equipment, or about reloading in general, or ideas for future videos, things you would like to see, leave them in the comments section below. And I'm going to do my very best to respond to you individually and quickly. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel. You will get notifications in your subscription section when new videos become available. This is the Red-Blooded American saying, get out and shoot. Go enjoy your Second Amendment rights. After all, it's the Second Amendment that makes all the others possible. Have a great day.